Hello, I'm Michele from the Portland Public Library in Portland, Maine, coming to you from our children's room. Thank you for joining me for part 3 of our read aloud of Sofia Valdez and the Vanishing Vote, written by Andrea Beaty, illustrated by David Roberts, and published by Amulet Books. Part 3. Chapter 11. Sofia's cheeks got hot and she felt panicky inside. She said, I learned it at the library. Thought it might help. It was an emergency. She waited for the laughter to start, but there was no laughter. Instead, Miss Greer put her hand on Sofia's shoulder and smiled. Oh, Sofia, said Miss Greer. That's it. That's what? Asked Sofia. An emergency, said Miss Greer. A library emergency. She left the room and returned with the school librarian, Mrs. Catherine Bookbinder. Mrs. Bookbinder was one of Sofia's favorite people at Blue River Creek Elementary. She taught all the kids how to do research, and she read books with them. She helped them in the school makerspace, too. She was a great listener and always had the perfect book for everyone. Finding just the right book for just the right person at just the right time was Mrs. Bookbinder's superpower. Mrs. Bookbinder also loved hats. She always had the right hat for the right occasion. Her hat collection hung on hooks around the entire library. At the moment, she wore a black fedora with a card stuck into the band. The card said, Press. Miss Greer told me about your newspaper problem, she said. I've got some great books and resources to help, but our public library has an amazing collection of papers you need to see. I've already talked to Mr. Page. He'll expect you this afternoon. Pack your snacks, class, said Miss Greer. We're going on a field trip. Here is Miss Bookbinder. Chapter 12. That afternoon, the class headed to the Blue River Creek Library. Sofia loved the library and went there often. The public librarian, Mr. Page, was in a meeting, so they waited by some couches and beanbag chairs. Bee and Bo were there with a very tall, hairy dog and a calico cat. The animals wore red vests that said, Blue River Creek Reading Buddy. Everyone knew Bee and Bo. They drove the recycling truck and volunteered at the fire department. Sometimes they brought specially trained pets to the library so kids could read stories to them. Today they had 2 pets Sofia hadn't met before. Hello, said Bee, getting a lumpy spotted cat. This is the great Catsby. Catsby yawned and closed his eyes. He's thrilled to meet you, said Bee with a chuckle. Who is this? Asked Sofia, petting the large, long-haired dog next to Bo. This is Fido, said Bo. His full name is Fido Dostoevsky. He's a Russian bookhound. Fido nudged Iggy's hand. He wants you to read to him, said Bo. He loves sad poetry. Where's Virginia Woolf? Asked Sofia. And here's a picture of the kitty. Virginia was a black dog who was as big as the beanbag chair and just as floppy. She loved it when Sofia leaned up against her and read stories. She's in the doghouse, whispered Bo. She accidentally ate a book. Well, she slobbered on it, but Mr. Page is afraid Virginia will eat one. Afraid? Asked a tall, thin man who had appeared suddenly from behind a magazine rack. Who's afraid of Virginia Woolf? Not I, he said, scooting through the crowd of kids. I welcome all our furry friends except when they eat the books. Same goes for kids. Mr. Page wore a black vest covered with bumpy pockets, and he held a large magnifying glass. Aha, he said, that reminds me of a quote from my favorite book. He stuck his hand into one of the bumpy pockets and pulled out a teeny tiny blue book called Famous Author Quotes. It was the tiniest book Sofia had ever seen. He flipped the book open with his left thumb and held up the huge magnifying glass with his right hand. Here it is, he said. He cleared his throat and read, Outside of a dog, a book is man's best friend. Inside of a dog, it's too dark to read. Mr. Page laughed. Mark Twain was a smart one, and he stuck the book back into his pocket. Virginia Woolf can come back, he said, if she tries not to slobber so much. He scratched Fido's chin with a big smile. But first, Mrs. Bookbinder phoned about your library emergency. He looked through his magnifying glass at the students. He carefully inspected each face. At last, he lowered the magnifying glass and nodded slowly. He said, it looks serious. Chapter 13. We had some trouble with our newspaper, said Miss Greer. We're trying to write one with useful and accurate information for our readers. Perhaps you can help us. Aha, said Mr. Page. There's always help at the library. Mr. Page was an expert on newspapers. He led them through the town's collection. The archive had newspapers from Blue River Creek's earliest days. Newspapers have always helped shape our town and our country, he said. Good journalism is like a flashlight into the darkness. A free press means that the government can't tell you what to write, he said. That's important because it means the newspapers can tell the public when the government does something good and when it does something bad. It lets people know what's really going on. Without that, democracy gets in trouble. He reached into a pocket and pulled out a miniature green book. This is my favorite book, he said, looking for a specific page. I thought the blue one was your favorite, said Sophia. That was my favorite book about author quotes, said Mr. Page. This is my favorite book about reporting news. That's called journalism. Good journalism helps you understand all the facts, he said. It has to be accurate and tell the good and bad parts of a story. That's the news parts of the newspaper. But journalists also write editorials where they share their thoughts on the news. And sometimes, he said, people bend the news to show only their point of view. That's called bias. Sometimes they do it on purpose, but sometimes they don't even realize they're doing it. How can you tell what's what? Asked Sophia. Aha, said Mr. Page, looking at Sophia through the magnifying glass. That's it. What? Asked Sophia. That, said Mr. Page, is the most important question of all. No wonder they call you kids the Questioneers. You ask all the right questions. Mr. Page turned to leave. Wait, cried Sophia. You didn't answer the question. How can you tell when news is real? Oh, said Mr. Page, wheeling around and digging into his pocket. That's in my favorite book. And he held up a tiny orange book with 3 words on the cover. Read, question, think. 1, read. Read everything, he said. If you read from a wide variety of sources, you will learn to spot bias. For instance, if you read 10 stories and one leaves out important information or includes false statements, it will be obvious to you. Also, the more you read, the more you'll know about the topic. You'll get smarter too. 2, question. Question everything, he said. Ask questions and look for answers. 3, think, he said. A lot of people forget to think, but it's the most important step. Always think. Nobody can do that one for you. And you know what else? What? Asked the class. Here's what, he said. Nobody can think for you, but nobody can think for you, but nobody can think like you either. You are the only person who thinks the way you do. Someday there might be a problem and you'll be the only person who can solve it. You've got to be ready for that. Miss Greer nodded. Read, question, think, she said. That's good advice. And then, said Mr. Page, do you know what you do? What? Asked the class. Mr. Page smiled. You do it all over again. Read, question, think. That's a lot of work, said Sophia. Aha, said Mr. Page. Isn't everything that's worth doing? Besides, there's always help at the library. He stuffed the orange book back into his pocket and pulled out a tiny black one. And now I leave you with a final question from my favorite book, and he thumbed through the tiny pages. Where do library books like to sleep? Where? Asked Ada. Beneath their covers, said Mr. Page with a snort of laughter. Oh, geez, that's a good one. And with that, he ducked behind a bookshelf and was gone. Chapter 14. After school, Sofia waited for Abuelo by the flagpole as always. Her brain was swimming with ideas from the field trip. She was deep in thought when suddenly she heard an angry voice behind her. "Why didn't you tell me?" She turned around. It was Maricela. Sofia didn't have to ask what she meant. "If you're in charge of the election," said Maricela, "you could tell everyone to vote for the bird, and then if I have to give up Pickles, the class can take care of him. It solves everything." "I can't do that," said Sofia. "I can't tell people who to vote for. I have to be fair." "It's not fair if I have to get rid of my pet and you won't help me," said Maricela. "You could if you wanted to." Before Sofia could respond, Maricela turned her wheelchair and left. A moment later, Abuelo arrived. "I don't think I like being election commissioner," Sofia said. "No matter what I do, somebody will be mad at me." "You can't fix how other people feel," said Abuelo. "All you can do is the right thing. Everything else will sort itself out." Abuelo handed Sofia a warm cookie, and they walked home in silence. Chapter 15. The next morning, Miss Greer's classroom wall was covered with new articles from the class. Miss Greer stood back and put her hands on her hips. She smiled. "That's better," she said, clapping her hands. The newspaper was better, but things between Ada and Rosie were not. They weren't even speaking to each other. They were, however, very eager to talk to Sofia. And some of the titles of the new news articles are: "What do turtles eat?" "How to care for birds." "Talking with your bird." "How do you train a turtle?" "How to clean a turtle." "Famous birds of the world," and "Best bird names." "Did you know that birds are hurt by the climate crisis?" Rosie whispered on her way to the pencil sharpener. "And bird populations are dropping around the world. We need to help them." During spelling, Ada passed Sofia a note. "Did you know that turtles have existed for 215 million years, but some are going extinct?" Then Rosie sent a note with a drawing of a flock of birds. Ada saw that, frowned, and sent another note with a picture of Sofia holding a turtle. Before long, Sofia's pockets were stuffed with notes. Sofia was relieved when it was time for the class debate. She still didn't know who she was going to vote for, but at least the election would be over soon and things could get back to normal. Rosie had brought Gizmo to add some interest to her presentation. Ada had borrowed a turtle named George from her cousin and had him in a small pen on the floor. Ada and Rosie stood beside each other but didn't look at each other. Miss Greer introduced each of them and their teams cheered. Then she called on Sofia to say a few words and ask some questions the class had written. Sofia walked to the front of the class. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her folded speech. As she did, her friend's notes tumbled to the floor. Sofia unfolded her speech and began to read. "We, the students in Miss Lila Greer's class, stand here today on the brink of a new era in grade 2, she began. "Never before has any class," she looked at the scraps of paper on the floor. "Never before has any class," Sofia paused. She looked again at the scraps on the floor. "Never." Suddenly, Sofia refolded her speech. She looked at Ada and Rosie and her classmates with their bird and turtle buttons. She looked at Miss Greer. "Go ahead," said Miss Greer. "My speech was fancy and talked about why elections are important and their history," Sofia said, "but I forgot something." She took a deep breath and continued. "Actually," Sofia said, "we forgot something. We forgot something important," she continued. "We got so excited about the election that we forgot why we're having one. Our election isn't about birds or turtles or pets at all. It's about deciding on something we care about together." Sofia smiled. "Together," she said. "That's the important part. In a community, we have to care about each other and listen to each other," she continued. "Otherwise, we won't want to be a community anymore, and it won't matter if we have a bird or a turtle or even if we have a pet at all." "Well," Sofia finished quietly, "that's all I wanted to say." The class burst into applause. Miss Greer nodded and smiled. Ada and Rosie looked at each other and then looked at Sofia, and then they squished in for a big hug. "I'm sorry," whispered Rosie, Me too, whispered Ada, and they both hugged Sofia, who felt a big wave of relief wash over her. It was going to be okay after all. Rosie and Ada stepped out of the huddle and shook hands, and the debate began. And here's the big hug. And we are going to stop there for part 3 of Sofia Valdez and the Vanishing Vote by Andrea Beaty, illustrated by David Roberts, published by Amulet Books. I'm Michele at the Portland Public Library, and I'll see you next time for part 4. Bye.